It's FYF Sports. It's Lamont. We are back with another podcast episode. We got some breaking news out of the NFL today. This is a case that we have been following here on FYF Sports for over a year now. We've done our best to go above and beyond doing our research and due diligence in investigating this particular case, where it might ultimately lead, what facts are being hidden, who is being shady, and we unveiled a lot during the course of our own investigation. When we talk about the women in this case, pulling up their Instagram pages, when we talk about how a lot of them deleted their Instagram pages or removed posts that might have suggested them being internet thoughts or prostitutes. We were the ones to expose those details. But we've been following this case, the trajectory, the timeline, and this was a very anticipated decision from Sue L. Robinson. So before we dive deeper into this topic, I'm going to let you guys know who Sue L. Robinson is. Sue L. Robinson is a former U.S. District Court judge, and the NFL tasked her with making the decision on this case because the NFL has been scarred in the past from laying a heavy hand on players. But then when it comes to owners who've been in similar situations, it seems like the owners get a pass. And so I think Roger Goodell wanted to, because this case was so high profile, but because we're talking about a quarterback who could at his peak potentially be considered a top 5 quarterback in the league. There's so much money to be had, so much money to be lost. I think they wanted to appear to be impartial. And so they hired and they tasked Sue L. Robinson with fully investigating this. I think when you follow the timeline of the case, her and her team did an extremely intricate job of conducting interviews, investigations, interviewing outside witnesses to come to this particular decision right here. I mean, even considering some of the criminal elements, which also helped them come to this conclusion. So her conclusion, as you guys already may know, is she determined that Deshaun Watson will be suspended for 6 games for violating the NFL's code of conduct policy. And now that's what we kind of anticipated going into this. I think I said in a previous video, I do feel that Deshaun Watson put himself in a situation that put the integrity of the league at stake. But when you look at this particular case, the NFL actually made 3 allegations against Deshaun Watson, and it was on Sue L. Robinson to determine the guilt or innocence of him in regards to this particular case. So what happened today, earlier before the decision was announced, Deshaun Watson did settle 3 more cases. So that's 23 of the 24 cases that have been settled to date. And that's going into her decision. But man, what we're going to be doing today is the actual 16-page document. The actual 16-page document detailing Sue L. Robinson's decision has been released. And, I don't want to go through the entire document, but I do want to go through the document to touch on some very key points that led Sue L. Robinson to coming to the conclusion that she did. And this is what baffles me most before we get into the actual document itself. When we see people like women.org go to TMZ, really bashing Sue L. Robinson and the NFL for this particular decision. When we see people like Stephen A. Smith, he's been on a hiatus. He's been on a hiatus all this time. And as soon as this drops, he comes out of the blue and he makes a very confusing statement. I can't tell if he's trying to side with Deshaun Watson or if he's trying to decide with the feminist base that he's trying to cater to so he doesn't get canceled. I don't know what he's trying to do with some of the things that he's saying. But you see a lot of people in mainstream media attempting to toe the line, play it safe. And I think the safest bet is to just simply side with, he deserved a lengthier punishment. I mean, even the NFL going into this requested an indefinite suspension. They wanted to play the side of giving the impression that they actually care, giving the impression that they consider this to be a serious matter, irregardless of what the facts of the case actually state. So what happens when you put a U.S. District Court judge in this particular case? A lot of biases, a lot of the emotions get removed. This is an experienced U.S. District Court judge who was willing to sit down and weigh every aspect of this case, and not just weigh the aspects of this case, but how do these elements correlate to the NFL's code of conduct policy? Because that was what was at stake here. This was not a criminal matter. She's not determining if federal charges are brought up, right? She's not determining if state charges are brought up. She's taking the facts of this case and basically correlating that to the NFL's code of conduct policy and where does it fit in? And did Deshaun Watson violate any of those elements? So we're going to go ahead and pull that document up here. We're going to be going through some of the key points of this document that I feel led to her making this decision. And this was a decision that we definitely predicted. I kind of foresaw this coming because once you start reading more and more the facts of this case, it starts to become very clear that Tony Busby and the 24 women that he's representing, something extremely shady has been going on with regards to their side from the onset of this case. And it just didn't look good from start to finish on their side, with the inconsistencies, with the lies, with the deleted text messages and all these things. But we're going to get to all of that here in this deposition. Let's go ahead and bring it up right here. All right, so here we have, this is the full 16-page document of Sue L. Robinson's decision. And so as you guys see here, this is just a legal document that was released. And it just, the start of this document simply kind of lays the groundwork for how her decision was made. She talks about the collective bargaining agreement to begin with. As we start, she talks about the NFL's code of conduct policy, how it relates to players, how it relates to owners, and then how it should be interpreted as it's currently worded right now. So that's what the first 2 pages really get into. So she's really breaking down the language of the NFL's own policy and how she can apply this policy to the evidence and the information that she has on Deshaun Watson right now, and then correlate that to his case to come to a determination. So again, she did a really good job of laying the groundwork for elements that she needed to search for if she was looking to find Deshaun Watson guilty or innocent in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to page 3. And in page 3 of this document, I think this is one of the more important pages because it says this starts by saying, for the record, and I'm going to read this part right here. It says it is important to note at the outset, serving as a jointly appointed disciplinary officer, my decision is limited by the record presented to me. Very good wording right there. She can't go outside of the information that's presented to her. It's the onus is on the NFL to prove their case. Similar to a court of law, the NFL needs to prove their case. So she says the record was compiled in connection with the NFL's allegations that Deshaun Watson, a player in the NFL, violated 3 provisions of the policy by engaging in 1, sexual assault, 2, conduct that poses a genuine danger to the safety and well-being of another person, and 3, conduct that undermines or puts at risk the integrity of the NFL. She says these allegations stem from a series of civil suits, the first of which was filed in March 2021. And she says the first complainant alleged that Mr. Watson engaged in lewd and indecent sexual behavior during a private massage she provided. And then she says a total of 23 other lawsuits having similar allegations were eventually filed against Watson. And the NFL opened their investigation into Watson's conduct upon learning of the first lawsuit. So now we have the charges presented by the NFL. The NFL alleged 1 sexual assault, which we know that charge was weakened because even the criminal justice system couldn't even find him guilty of that. 2, conduct that poses a genuine danger to the safety and well-being of another person. Well, we know that allegation was extremely discredited, as the NFL themselves admitted that they found no evidence of violence or anything harmful to another person. So the NFL kind of shot themselves in the foot right there with that allegation. And then when we go to the third allegation, and I think this is the one that's a bit more broad, where the NFL gets a lot of players' conduct that undermines or puts the risk and integrity of the NFL in jeopardy. So those were the three allegations brought forth. So when we look at people like women's.org, when we look at people like Stephen A. Smith crying about the 6-game suspension, well, Sue L. Robinson could only work within the scope of these three particular charges. And when you put that in conjunction with the NFL's code of conduct policy, is she able to find Deshaun Watson guilty or innocent? So this right here, the first 3 pages beautifully lay the groundwork for how she made her decision in this case. We're gonna go ahead and scroll down to some additional information, where she really starts to unveil some of the things that were going on behind the scenes that helped her get to this particular decision. All right, and as we progress further through the document, she detailed the NFL's investigation. So the NFL did their own investigation, and she states in this document the NFL's investigation was conducted by 2 former prosecutors with decades of experience investigating sexual assault cases. And she states, although Mr. Watson allegedly worked with more than 60 massage therapists during a 15-month period beginning in the fall of 2019 through the winter of 2021, the NFL only investigated the claims of 24 therapists suing Watson for damages. Of these 24 complainants, the NFL investigators were only able to interview 12, right? And we'll get to why they only interviewed 12. And she says, of those 12, the NFL relied for its conclusions on the testimony of 4 therapists, as well as the interviews of some 37 other third parties and substantial documentary evidence. And so when we talk about this now, the NFL conducted their own investigation. They used 2 former prosecutors, right? They considered the testimony of 24 women, right? 12 refused to comply with the NFL, primarily because of how invasive their investigation was. So a lot of them didn't want the NFL digging into their information, making a lot of things public that they didn't want to come to light. So the NFL could only rely on 12 of the women who actually complied and wanted to speak with the NFL. And of those 12, only 4 were able to get through the cracks with something that could be considered compelling evidence that wasn't tainted by lies or something illicit going on. But let's go ahead and proceed. Okay, so I really appreciated this part of the document as well. It talks about the NFL's actual investigation. She summarized it by saying, during the critical time period, Mr. Watson had a contract with the Houston Texans. And again, a lot of you guys in my last videos were saying, because he requested that trade out of Houston, this is something that was conjured up by the Houston Texans owners, who's also neighbors with Tony Busby, the lawyer for the 24 women being represented in this case. It's starting to look very suspicious the more you dig into that. We're going to be dropping the video on that connection as well. But it also says, despite having access to team provided and approved massage therapists, Watson sought out private massages and, according to the NFL, used his status as an NFL player as pretext to engage in a premeditated pattern of predatory behavior towards multiple women. Now, look. This is the NFL's conclusion. This is not Sue L. Robinson's conclusion. So the NFL concluded this. Now, they further say that the pattern of conduct described by the NFL includes the following steps. Mr. Watson identified himself from the outset of each encounter as a quarterback for the NFL via Instagram. We saw some of the women's Instagram pages, just basically IG thoughts or just pure prostitution. But Mr. Watson's requests were typically urgent, wanting to schedule a massage that day. He was not looking for a professional setting and often inquired as to whether the massages would be private. It says Mr. Watson admitted that he was not concerned with whether the women were experienced massage therapists or even licensed therapists. And it says of the 4 therapists It says of the 4 therapists who are subject to the report, remember only 4 could be deemed credible enough to even be put in this report. Only 3 were licensed and operating their own businesses. The 4th therapist was working towards her licensure. And it says Mr. Watson would follow his Instagram, would follow on Instagram, it would contact the women with texts or calls before each session to make sure the therapists were comfortable massaging certain areas of his body, particularly lower back, glutes, abs, groin area. Those are the focal points. We heard those details, and it says Mr. Watson requested that the therapist use a towel to cover his private areas rather than the sheet that's typically used. And again, sheets are common when you're at these massages, but in private massages, we know that those are probably going to be optional. It says Mr. Watson often provided his own towels, and one of the reasons why I think Deshaun Watson provided his own towels, because I think the women knew, and I think Deshaun Watson knew what they were both there for. And I think by him providing his own towel, he controlled at least some piece of evidence that could potentially be used against him, because we know that women like to try to set people up, do things. So he just brought his own towels and things like that so he could leave with everything. We look at the Monica Lewinsky situation with Bill Clinton, how she held on to certain pieces of clothing, and it ultimately ended up being used against Bill Clinton later down the line. So obviously we all know that, I think we can all admit that we know he was linking up with these women on IG because he was intending for these sessions to be sexual as opposed to therapeutic. Now it says the towels were considered to be medium to small Gatorade towels, and these are generally the towels provided by the team. It says once in the massage sessions, each of the therapists alleged that Mr. Watson engaged in what the NFL has characterized as sexualized behavior. This behavior includes Mr. Watson's insistence that the therapist work on focal points with just a towel to cover. And then remember, these stories were so consistent. It's literally essentially what every woman would say. And I think that was also an alert for Sue L. Robinson as well. The stories just matched up too perfectly. Everyone had the same exact experience. While all these lies were also being found. And it says when he turned over on his back, it is alleged that Watson exposed himself and purposely contacted the therapist's hands, arms multiple times with the erect penis. This is one of the therapists alleges that Watson did not only contact her arm multiple times, but that he ejaculated on her arm. There's no allegation that Watson exerted any force against any of the therapists. So again, none of the women went as far as alleging that he exerted any force. So when you look at the NFL's 3 allegations against Deshaun Watson, they kind of shoot themselves in the foot, because as they start to investigate some of these women, as they start to interview not just the women, but also interview, it says up to 37 outside witnesses who had direct contact with these women, it was easily indicated there was nothing forced in these massage appointments with the women. Okay, and so now Sue L. Robinson, again, she summarized what the NFL concluded, and now she moves on to what my findings are. And this is where, remember, she only can take the information that's been presented and then come to a determination. And she says the NFL alleges that Watson violated 3 provisions of the policy by engaging in sexual assault, conduct that poses a danger to the safety and well-being of another person, and conduct that undermines or puts at risk the integrity of the NFL. And she says, I will address each in turn. And so when you talk about conduct that qualifies as sexual assault, what she does in this is she defines what sexual assault actually is. I mean, if the NFL would have created their own definition for sexual assault and put it in their bylaws, that would be one thing, but they didn't do that. So she can only go off what the actual legal definition of what sexual assault is. And she explains this here in this particular section. And she says the record presented by the NFL to support its allegation of a sexual assault includes many undisputed facts. For instance, there is no dispute that Watson used Instagram to contact the therapist, and that he was clearly identified He clearly identified to all the women that he was an NFL player. That wasn't disputed. She says there is also no dispute that he reached out for private massages with the women whose professional qualifications were unknown to him, nor were the professional qualifications explored. We know what professional qualification most of these women were in, and we all know what he was exploring. It says Mr. Watson always forecasted his desire that certain areas of the body be massaged. So she talks about how he always had told the women ahead of time, and this is documented. He always told them ahead of time what he wanted done, what they were to expect at the massage, right? She's basically confirming that he communicated these things before these massages even happened. She says in all 4 cases, the therapists were willing to go forward with the massage. They knew what he requested. They were willing to go forward with what he requested. And she says in all 4 cases, they were willing to go forward with the massage. However, none of the therapists were willing to offer him services again. All right. She says, finally, there is no dispute. And that's only of these 4 women. And this is where the NFL got caught being slick, because of the 12 women that they actually interviewed, 8 of the women came back and offered him return services, even after they claimed that they had such a horrendous appointment the first time. So the NFL was slick. The NFL excluded, of the 12 women that they interviewed, they excluded 8 that actually did multiple massages on them. Because again, if you feel like you're being assaulted, attacked, harmed in any way, why would you consistently come back and do multiple massages? It completely just kills your credibility. So the NFL was slick here by narrowing it down to the 4 women who he did not follow up for secondary massages. And so she also concludes that finally there is no dispute that Mr. Watson preferred a towel to the traditionally used sheet for draping, and that there should be no dispute. A medium size or small towel will more than likely slip off the body than having a sheet leaving a client exposed. Again, what she's saying is, if he's telling the women these things before the massage, they are willing participants in this. And so importantly, she says much of the alleged conduct is not in and on itself challenged as wrongful. So the NFL is just presenting a whole bunch of information that they feel could slander him in the public eye, but it's not necessarily wrongful. She says the use of Instagram to buy businesses or gauge a business, she said, is commonplace. She says there is evidence in the record that Mr. Watson's focus points, lower back, glutes, abs, and groin area, are legitimate focal areas for professional athletes, right? She says, moreover, it is not unusual for therapists to inadvertently contact a male client's penis while treating these legitimate focus areas, nor for male clients to get an erection during massages, right? And then she also, again, she has reference points to this. So when she makes this conclusion, what she did is, again, I'll put a link to this document for you guys in the description of the video, because what she did was she has reference points for each of these things. She didn't just come to this conclusion. This conclusion was determined by her speaking with literally hundreds of other practice massage therapists. So again, she spoke with professional and practice massage therapists about this, and they informed her that the things that the women claim were assault are actually commonplace when you're dealing with athletes. Again, the NFL is kind of killing itself with some of the just odd language that they use in going at Deshaun Watson. It says right here, it says Deshaun Watson has not testified that he had erections and inadvertently touched the therapist here. He says instead he has categorically denied allegations against him, including that he ever developed an erection during the massage. So Deshaun Watson, even though some of the women or all of the women are claiming the same thing, he's saying that this never happened. It's difficult to give weight to a complete denial when weighted against the credible testimony of the investigators who interviewed the therapist and other third parties. She says, moreover, the totality of the evidence, including the undisputed facts relating to Mr. Watson's use of towels focal points and the not uncommon experience of massage therapists to have contact with an erect penis of the male clients lends to support my conclusion that it is more probable than not Watson did have erections and that his erect penis contacted the therapist as claimed by them. So she sided with the women there because she doesn't dispute that he became erect. But see, what the women are alleging and the NFL tried to allege is that when that happens, that's the assault. And what she's saying is, based on the testimony, based on the documented evidence that she has, that's actually commonplace in professional massages and is not to be considered any form of assault. So it says, with respect to whether the contact was intentional, the matter of intent generally must be inferred from circumstantial evidence in the absence of an admission. The women are just making these claims. Remember, all of the women make these odd claims that he touched them. They all have the same story. But she says it's not backed by any circumstantial evidence. She says, in this case, Mr. Watson reached out to the women whose professional qualifications were unknown and unimportant to him. He insisted on using the towel, increasing the probability of exposure. He insisted on having therapists to focus on certain areas of his body that not uncommonly trigger erections. And he says, and he engaged in this pattern of conduct multiple times. Those things are all factual. She says, I find sufficient circumstantial evidence to support the NFL's contention, not only that contact occurred, but that Mr. Watson was aware that contact probably would occur and that Mr. Watson had a sexual purpose, not just a therapeutic purpose, in making these arrangements with these therapists. And again, that's something that I agree with as well. I agree that his intent with these women, the intent there was for a sexual purpose. That can be simply proven by looking at the women's IG pages. All of the women have since deleted their IG pages, but none of these women had normal standard IG pages. They were not standard. They were not common, right? When you are sitting on a massage table, and this is for example, the Ashley Solis sitting on a massage table, with little to nothing on, saying DM me for an appointment. We all know what you're suggesting. And we're going to get to that later. She says, finally, I find that the NFL has procured sufficient circumstantial evidence to prove the last prong of the test that Watson knew such sexualized contact was unwanted. And so this is where I kind of disagree with it. She said, I don't think the NFL provided any circumstantial evidence to prove that Watson knew their sexual contact was unwanted. I believe the contact was wanted because what the NFL did was they narrowed their sample size down to 4 women who didn't follow up for a secondary appointment. This was not the case for the other 8 women that chose to interview with the NFL who had multiple follow-up appointments making the same allegations. Because if it was unwanted, why would you have multiple appointments? So again, that's one of the elements right there that I disagree with. But we'll go ahead and proceed. And she says, of course, there is no indication on record that even experienced therapists want such contact. And Mr. Watson certainly did not seek out the most experienced therapist. Moreover, there is credible evidence that one of the therapists expressed her discomfort of the unwanted contact to Mr. Watson during the session, and another of the therapists ended the session early. She says, given that none of the therapists accepted Mr. Watson's invitations to engage in further therapy sessions, she says, I find sufficient evidence to demonstrate Mr. Watson knew or should have known that any contact between his private area and the therapist was unwanted. So, again, with the limited information that she has, in this element of the case, I think she sided with the NFL primarily because of the lack of evidence. One, because Deshaun Watson was not very compliant in explaining why he had an erection. If he did have one, he just is simply making the allegation that he just didn't. He's saying it never happened. As opposed to the 4 women out of the 12 that they interviewed were able to provide some form of documented evidence to infer that they didn't want to follow up with other appointments and that the contact between his private areas and those women was unwanted. So again, this is just one of the elements that at least helped her come to the conclusion. But we'll go ahead and proceed. And she says, I therefore find that the NFL has carried this burden of proof by a preponderance of evidence, which again is a lower burden of proof, that Mr. Watson engaged in sexual assault as defined by the NFL against the 4 therapists identified in the report. She says Mr. Watson violated the policy in this regard. So she felt that he violated this potential element of the policy because of some of the things that we just explained. So when we talk about conduct that poses a genuine danger to the safety and well-being of another person, this was the second element. This was the second element of the NFL's allegations against Deshaun Watson. What she does is she then, as before, she outlays what defines what this rule actually is and how the NFL should define it based on their own wording and their own policies. And she really breaks it down. So she breaks down what it actually is and how it should be defined. And her summary in this one right here is, all right, so her finding here is, she says, when comparing the above evidence, so when she looks at all of the evidence that was weighed against other examples of violent conduct prohibited by the NFL's policy, she said it is apparent that the NFL has taken the occasion to broadly define the concept of genuine danger, safety, and well-being in its charge against Watson. So she kind of admits that the NFL is using this particular aspect of the policy extremely broadly. Remember, when we talk about some of the owners and some of the troubles that the owners were in, the NFL was very broad in using this policy to not charge the owners or give them lengthy suspension, as opposed to this situation where they're trying to use the same policy to suspend Deshaun Watson. She says, I accept the fact that a work environment with sexualized conduct is not a safe environment. She says, I accept as credible the testimony of the therapist that they felt unsafe and suffered emotional distress as a result of their massage sessions with Mr. Watson. She says, based on the NFL's broad interpretation of this prohibited conduct as reflected in the evidence, she said it chose to present, because remember that the NFL presented all the evidence. She says, I find the NFL has carried its burden of proof by preponderance of the evidence. Mr. Watson's conduct posed a genuine danger to the safety and well-being of the other person. Now, I know some of you guys are going to be going through this and be like, how is she finding him in violation of some of these rules? You got to understand all of the evidence that she's weighing. This is all evidence submitted by the NFL. All of the evidence submitted by the NFL was meant and designed to make Deshaun Watson look bad, right? Remember, the NFL was very crafty in what they did. They interviewed, remember, there were 24 women in this case. 12 refused to speak to the NFL. The 12 that interviewed with the NFL, only 4 of them were found to be credible enough to even present this information to Sue L. Robinson. So there were 8 women who just were simply so uncredible that NFL couldn't even present any of their testimony from those women to Sue L. Robinson. So that's where we get the 4 women from in this case. So you'll see that being referenced a lot, the 4 women, and everybody keeps saying, what happened to the other 20? That's why. So now we get to the last aspect of it. And I feel like this is the only aspect that, because again, it's another very broadly defined policy, conduct that undermines or puts at risk the integrity of the NFL. It's extremely broad. You can literally jaywalk and the NFL can say you put the integrity of the NFL in jeopardy. I mean, you could literally do anything, any violation of the law. We've seen players get hit with this for driving without a license. We saw another player get suspended for an entire year, betting on his team to win a game. It's broadly defined. And of course, we know that just how this particular policy is defined, he's going to be found guilty. And she states, in this regard, the NFL has just demonstrated that Mr. Watson identified himself as a player for the NFL to initiate contact with the therapist. So again, Watson used his status in the NFL to attract the women to him, which again, the blue check mark, I don't know why he needed to announce that, but he uses NFL status to even get appointments with the women. And it says he used his ties to the Texans to reinforce his request for massages to focus on his lower back, glutes, abs, and groin area. And she says, having established himself in this context, the NFL has again demonstrated that Watson engaged in sexualized conduct during the massages. She also finds evidence sufficient to demonstrate that Watson's conduct undermined the integrity of the NFL in the eyes of the therapist. And she says Mr. Watson also has been scrutinized on a national level, as Mr. Watson's alleged conduct has been a matter of public record and discourse over an extended period of time. Regardless of my findings, it is apparent that Mr. Watson acted with reckless disregard for the consequences of his action by exposing himself and the NFL to such public scrutiny and speculation. Mr. Watson's predatory conduct casts a negative light on the league and its players, sufficient proof that he violated this provision of the policy. So again, this is the only aspect that I feel that he actually violated. But we also see that it's another broadly worded policy that the NFL has that really didn't give Sue L. Robinson much leeway to decide otherwise. And so now we get to the most important part. So she's admitted that based on the information that the NFL's provided, she's saying that she's found guilt by a preponderance of the evidence with the 4 women. I don't know if she would have had the same conclusion had the NFL provided the testimony of the other 8 women. But based on the information that the NFL submitted to Sue L. Robinson, she's now tasked with disciplinary determination. All right. And so we're going to go through, how did she come to this particular decision? The 6 games that so many people are saying is outlandish, is crazy. Deshaun Watson should be canceled, should never play another NFL game. Stephen A., who's so confused, women's org, who don't know a lick about this case. They just know that some women cry foul. They want him gone from the planet Earth. How did Sue L. Robinson come to 6 games? You guys just heard all 3 elements of the case based on the information. You guys just heard she's essentially found him guilty by a preponderance of the evidence. She states, having found that the NFL carried his burden of proof by a preponderance of the evidence, Mr. Watson did violate the policy in various ways. She said, it's my responsibility to review any recommended discipline for consistency of treatment. That's going to be key right there. Consistency of treatment, uniformity standards for parties, similarly situated. When we think about the owners charged in similar cases, the owner of the Patriots caught in the prostitution sting, and Jerry Jones. All right. So uniformity of standards for parties similarly situated, and patent unfairness or selectivity. Right. When we talk about these allegations arose right out of the blue when he requested a trade. Right. Was it unfair? Was it just simply selective activity? Is this something conjured up by the Houston, Texas owners? Remember Tony Busby, the neighbor of the owner. And, does that just happen? I don't know. I don't know if that's something that just coincidence. But she says the task includes examining existing disciplinary standards, prior disciplinary outcomes, and considering mitigating and aggregating factors, all with the goal of reaching a fair conclusion. And so remember, that's key as well. Considering mitigating and aggregating factors in this suspension. So she says the NFL recommended that Watson be suspended for the entire 22 season, NFL regular and postseason, and not be permitted to return unless he satisfies conditions imposed for reinstatement. And she says, according to the NFL, if this recommended sentence is unprecedented, that is because his conduct is unprecedented. It says the NFL's reasoning is reflected in the following testimony. And we've heard over the last couple of weeks that the NFL was really pushing for an indefinite suspension, where they could and I think indefinite suspensions are kind of to weigh the public eye. When is the best time? When is it going to be okay for the NFL to reinstate him? Right? Maybe there are other things going on in sports where they can kind of quietly reinstate him, bring him back, and the NFL, they're not going to get slaughtered in the media. And then she talks about the NFL Players Association. She says they responded by first relating, the history of the policy, the disciplines imposed in the policy, prior NFL disciplinary actions She talked about Ray Rice in 2014. She says there were no standards differentiating violent conduct from other prohibited conduct. She talks about the NFL Players Association talked about when Roger Goodell followed such precedent despite the violence of Ray Rice's conduct. It was only the public outcry that made him change things. So again, the optics, the NFL has always, in this case, been playing the optics. They've always played the optics, and the Players Association is explaining this to Sue L. Robinson. She says this is why they're requesting a full year. They're simply trying to play the optics once again for the public. All right. And so the Players Association laid out their case as well in support of Deshaun Watson as we get to page 13 of this document. And she says, a demonstrated exhibit used during the hearings indicates that since the revisions to the policy, by far the most commonly imposed discipline for domestic or gendered violence and sexual acts is six games. So she's saying the most common punishment for these types of acts has been 6 games. She says only 2 players have been suspended for 8 games. One for multiple incidents of domestic violence, and the second for the assault of multiple victims. She says a single player has been suspended 10 games for multiple incidents of domestic violence for which that player pled guilty to battery. So that was a case where the player actually was criminally charged and pled guilty. And she says it is undisputed that Watson's conduct does fall into the category of violent conduct. So she basically says she feels that his behavior falls into the category of violent conduct that will require a minimum 6-game suspension. She says, likewise, it is undisputed that prior cases involving non-violent sexual assault have resulted in discipline far less severe than what the NFL proposes here. So when we talk about the owner of the Patriots, non-violent cases, right, where there are sexual policy violations, she says those punishments were far less severe. Not even a 3-game suspension in some cases. So she says, I am bound by standards of fairness and consistency of treatment among players similarly situated. The NFL argues that consistency is not possible because there are no similarly situated players. But she says by ignoring past decisions, right? So the NFL kind of laid this bed. She says by ignoring past decisions, because none involve similar conduct. However, the NFL is not just equating violent conduct with non-violent conduct, but has elevated the importance of the latter without any substantial evidence to support its position. So she says, while it may be entirely appropriate to more severely discipline players for non-violent sexual conduct, she says, I do not believe it is appropriate to do so without notice of extraordinary change this position portends for the NFL and its players. So the NFL has kind of laid this foundation for the potential punishment. And she is using consistency and fairness. You know, if Roger Goodell is going to go easy on some of the owners, if he's going to go easy on some other players whose names might not be as big in the media, you have to keep the same consistency with Deshaun Watson. And so again, she alludes to that fairness. As you read through this document, as we get to the end of it, she talks about fairness going into her conclusion. And she has to maintain some level of consistency, a standard of consistency. That's the only way she can come to a conclusion here. And so we get to now her conclusion as we end this document. She says, the NFL may be a forward-facing organization, but it is not necessarily a forward-looking one. Just as the NFL responded to violent conduct after public outcry, she says, so it seems the NFL is responding to yet another public outcry about Watson's conduct. She says she is concluding that what the NFL is doing here is simply responding to public outcry as opposed to sticking to what their policies were intended to do. The ranges of suspensions for certain penalties for crimes or certain violations. She says they're trying to go outside of this scope. They're trying to go outside of the scope simply because of people like Stephen A. Smith, who's exaggerating it, Molly Karam, Sari Spain, who don't read any of the facts, who don't do any investigative journalism. They just say things to galvanize certain masses. And that's all they do. So the NFL is responding to public outcry. That's what she determined. She says, looking at the record when compared to relevant precedent and looking forward to how this disciplinary determination might be used in the future, she says, I find the most appropriate landing place to be as follows. She says, Watson is hereby suspended, as we already know, 6 games, regular season without pay. She says, although this is the most significant punishment ever imposed on an NFL player for allegations of non-violent sexual misconduct. So again, she says, this is a punishment being imposed. She said, this is the biggest punishment imposed on a player for allegations of non-violent sexual conduct. So she's actually going above the standard for what the NFL actually does. She said, Mr. Watson's pattern of conduct is more egregious than any before review by the NFL. So she's saying his circumstance is a bit more egregious than what we saw with the Patriots owner, than what we saw with, some other players, than what we saw with Jerry Jones. So if you're being honest, even if you're a Browns fan, you have to admit, this is a bit more egregious, even though there were no criminal charges. It is a bit more egregious. So you have to take that in consideration. So she's saying if she went by what the NFL normally does, he would have only been suspended 3 games. She elevated it to 6 because it is common sense tells her this is slightly different. This is a little different. All right. She says Mr. Watson is to have no adverse involvement with law enforcement and must not commit any additional violations of the policy. That's something that he must do. She talks about recognizing that the only discipline mentioned in the CBA is a fine or suspension. She says, I nevertheless believe it is appropriate for Mr. Watson to limit his massage therapy to club-directed sessions and club-approved massage therapists for the duration of his career, and so to impose this mandate as a condition to his reinstatement. So, again, I don't think Deshaun Watson's going to have any issue with that particular aspect to his reinstatement. I think he'll be perfectly fine with that. And she says that the parties have 3 business days to appeal this particular determination. So there we have it right there. Sue L. Robinson, her determination, based on the information, the limited scope. Remember, this is a limited scope of information that she was provided by the NFL. And her determination was 6 games. All right. When we look at the 3 elements, that the NFL charged Deshaun Watson with under this particular policy: sexual assault, conduct that poses danger and safety to the well-being of another person, and conduct that undermines or puts the risk and integrity of the league in jeopardy. She found that there was a preponderance of evidence that supports he violated those particular rules based on the information that was provided to her by the NFL. All right. Now there were other elements, of this that she, and other pieces of a documentation that she used to come to this conclusion. Again, this summary is 16 pages, but there are a lot of footnotes. Right. There are a lot of subbars of information that you can reference to and read that helped her come to this conclusion. But ultimately, she just told the NFL. She basically told the NFL, you can't run around going easy on the owners. You can't run around going easy on who you choose to go light on and then expect me as an arbitrator in this case to throw the hammer at Deshaun Watson. She did her job. She came to the conclusion that she needed to come to based on the information that she had. Now, a lot of people are going to take this conclusion. They're going to be like, oh, this is so egregious. She found him guilty on all charges. Why wasn't it more? But you have to understand, she only found him guilty by a preponderance of the evidence based on the information that the NFL submitted. This is not what she's doing here. It's almost like a kangaroo court, to say the least. And that's because the NFL had to provide documentation to her. I don't know if Deshaun Watson's team had much leeway to provide supporting documents. So the NFL investigators provided what they needed to Sue L. Robinson, and now it backfired on him, and it backfired on Roger Goodell and the NFL because they've been scared to lay the law down fairly across the board to owners, to players alike. And now when it comes to time for Deshaun Watson's penalty phase, he was given 6 games, which she even said, according to the NFL's history, this 6 games is more than what you normally give. So be happy with the 6 that I'm giving, because she really did the NFL a favor. So for all the people out there like Stephen A. Smith, Molly Karam, Sarah Spain, all these people clamoring for Deshaun Watson to be suspended more than 6 games, and you haven't pushed for the suspension of anyone else with the non-violent sexual assault policy violations, if you haven't pushed for that with anyone else, why are you pushing for it with Deshaun Watson? And like I said here, like I've always said, the information that was given to the grand juries was much more damning. See, because the NFL, the grand jury in the court of law, you can't be selective with what information goes to a grand jury. Prosecutors can't handpick 4 people and say, we're only giving you the testimony of these 4 people and we're excluding the testimony of the other 8 in a court of law. And the reason why the grand juries declined to charge Deshaun Watson is because they heard the full testimony of everyone. They saw all of the damning evidence. And grand jury said there's no way we can charge this man with a crime based on the inconsistencies, based on the lies, based on the women deleting messages, based on some of the women getting caught telling different stories to one person and then coming into this case telling a completely different story just so they can hop on this case for money. So the grand jury saw information and evidence that Sue L. Robinson just wasn't able to see, right? Because this is an NFL process, right? So this is an NFL process ran by the NFL, controlled by the NFL, and the NFL in and of itself still couldn't get Deshaun Watson suspended for a full year because of their hypocrisy in how they treat white owners and how they tried to treat Deshaun Watson. So they kind of got caught with their hands in the cookie jar. You guys let me know, what do you think about this punishment? Obviously, you guys know how we feel here on FYF Sports. I don't agree with her ruling, but I understand why she made the ruling like she did. I understand why she said he was guilty based on the parameters of evidence. But that's because of how the NFL was very crafty in providing only certain details to her that made him look bad. Because they didn't provide all of the details. They shaded the evidence to her in a certain light to make him look a certain way. And they basically gave her the evidence in a manner to where if she was paid for, she could have easily given him a much more egregious or harsh punishment. And as a judge, as a former U.S. district judge, she was fair in this process. And she says she basically caught the NFL capping. You are not going to be able to suspend this man more than 6 games because that is not the standard or precedence that the NFL has set in the past. Hey, it's FYF Sports, man. You guys spam up the comments with your thoughts on this one. Again, this is something that no one else is talking about. A lot of people are simply talking about their feelings. A lot of people are running with narratives. Again, things like Stephen A. Smith, what he said today, things like Molly Karam, Sarah Spain, women.org. These people are going to try to push a certain narrative on you. They don't want you to think this process through. They don't want you to use any critical thinking. They don't want you to consider the fact that 2 grand juries declined the charge and that the grand jury saw different evidence than what Sue L. Robinson saw. I think a lot of people just simply need to read the document for yourself, come to your own conclusion, but then also do your own research into the women, into the criminal charges that were investigated, and no charges were brought forth out of that, and just come out of that from there. But as it stands right now, the NFL has not appealed. I expect the NFL to appeal. I'm not for sure what that appeal process looks like or how it will take, but I know the NFL is not going to bow out gracefully on this one after taking such a major L. But you guys spam up the comments. Let me know what you think about this particular story right here. I'm definitely looking forward to doing a live stream on this topic hearing from all of the football fans. Whether you're a Browns fan or not, I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Yeah, I want to get your guys' thoughts on this particular topic. Because I for some reason, something's telling me that this isn't over and that the NFL is not going to take this type of loss. But it's FYF Sports, man. It's another great podcast episode. Salute to you guys, man. Definitely. Should by midnight, we should be hitting 40K. So again, salute to everybody that's helped this channel grow and get to where it's at. The next push is to 50K. I mean, this month right here, I thought June and May were crazy when we were covering the NBA Finals. But now we've hit another record month, over 2 million views alone in the last 30 days. We're about to hit 40K subscribers. It looks like if we continue on this trajectory, 50K can happen in 1 to 2 months. And that push for 100K in December is more realistic. It's starting to look more and more realistic. So again, we're almost about to hit 10 million views total for this channel. That's almost 4 million views alone just this year alone. But you know what? That only happens when you guys support the content, when you guys share, like all the videos, when you guys comment and engage. That's the only way all of this happens. So man, again, Cash App is right there, man. If you guys want to support, make sure you hit the Cash App to support. It's definitely much appreciated. You know, anything that you can give that will allow us to continue to put out this type of content will definitely be appreciated. You know, it's videos like this. This is one of the reasons why we had to turn the monetization off on this page. This is one of the reasons why we have to seek monetization through other channels, sponsorships, and things of that nature. Because when we touch on these topics, we can only speak on them from such a real perspective that a lot of times people like to report and do all types of crazy things with your videos. So just to kill that nonsense, we just rely on the community to support FYF Sports, man. Hey, look, y'all, we'll be back with more sports news. Make sure you tune into the live streams. Hit that notification bell. You don't want to miss the next couple videos that we got coming because we got some bangers coming very soon. Reaction videos are back. NFL season's about to start. Baseball about to kick into gear with the playoffs. Man, it's about to get crazy here on FYF Sports, man. It's been another great podcast episode. We will be back with more sports and news, but until then, it's FYF Sports. We out.